The Alaskan Boundary, Part 1. By Hon. John W. Foster, ex-Secretary of State. In the letter of the President of the Geographic Society inviting me to prepare a paper for the National Geographic Magazine, he expressed a desire that I should discuss the Alaskan boundary, because it was a subject that most deeply concerns our people, and the paper would be a timely contribution toward its proper consideration. In accepting the invitation, I feel that I must confine my presentation of the topic to the facts accessible to any student of the events of the period and avoid all reference to pending negotiations. Happily, however, the material at hand for an accurate understanding of the subject is abundant and within reach of the inquirer. Its history had its inception 3/4 of a century ago. Yet few negotiations among nations of such a date are accompanied by so great a mass of concurrent documents and facts to explain the motives and objects held in view by the interested parties, and to make apparent the understanding of these parties as to the effect of the negotiations after their conclusion. The Alaskan boundary is fixed by the Treaty of 1825 between Russia and Great Britain, and every step of the anterior negotiations was carefully recorded at the time, and the 70 or more years following the celebration of the treaty are marked by repeated acts of the contracting parties and those claiming under them, explaining their interpretation of that instrument. The Treaty of 1825 grew out of the issuance by the Emperor of Russia of an imperial ukase in 1821. The purpose of which, briefly stated, was 1. A claim by Russia to exclusive jurisdiction on the high sea extending 100 miles from the coast of Asia above latitude 45 degrees 50' north, and from the northwest coast of America above latitude 51 degrees north, and 2. A prohibition to all foreign vessels to land upon or trade with the natives on any part of the coasts indicated. This ukase brought forth a prompt and vigorous protest from both the United States and Great Britain, which was soon followed by negotiations between Russia and the two latter governments. It was early made known that Russia was prepared to withdraw its claim to exclusive jurisdiction in the Pacific Ocean, and would not insist upon its territorial claim to the coast of America below latitude 55 degrees. As the United States was advancing no serious claim to the territory north of that line, it found little difficulty in reaching an accord, and a treaty between Russia and the United States was signed April 17, 1824, nearly a year before an agreement was reached with Great Britain. The chief object had in view by Great Britain in its protest and subsequent negotiations was to secure the withdrawal by Russia of her claims to exclusive jurisdiction in the Pacific Ocean. At that period, Great Britain was the rising power of the world in maritime commerce, the United States being its next competitor, and it made good use of the latter to aid in bringing about this withdrawal. At that day, the vast territory of North America, lying between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean above latitude 55 degrees, was almost a terra incognita, and, with the immense areas to the east of the mountains still unoccupied, except by a few trading posts, the country was held in little estimation by Great Britain. A few navigators had skirted the coast, and enterprising American traders had held some intercourse with the Indians living immediately on tidewater, but none but the Russians had penetrated any distance inland. Only one British trading post was established in this region west of the Rocky Mountains, on the line of 55 degrees, and that 120 miles from the ocean, and there was not one above that line. But we are not left to infer from these historical facts what was the ruling motive and object of Great Britain in opening and prosecuting negotiations with Russia, for these are explicitly stated in the instructions given by the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, George Canning, to the British negotiators. At the very inception of the negotiations, he directed the attention of the first negotiator, Sir Charles Bagot, to "the extravagant assumption of maritime jurisdiction" as the essential point to be adjusted, and as Russia was prepared to waive her pretensions, the mode and degree of disavowal was to be so made as to least offend the national dignity of Russia. It was therefore determined that it would be made more easy for Russia to retire from its maritime claim under cover of a treaty of limits. This is made clear in the instruction given by the British Secretary for Foreign Affairs, December 8, 1824, to Sir Stratford Canning, who had succeeded Mr. Bagot in the negotiations. He says, quote, "The whole negotiation grows out of the ukase of 1821. So entirely and absolutely true is this proposition that the settlement of the limits of the respective possessions of Great Britain and Russia on the northwest coast of America was proposed by us as a mode of facilitating the adjustment of the differences arising from the ukase by enabling the court of Russia, under cover of the more comprehensive arrangement, to withdraw, with less appearance of concession, the offensive pretensions of that edict. It is comparatively indifferent to us whether we hasten or postpone all questions respecting the limits of territorial possession on the continent of America. But the pretensions of the Russian ukase of 1821 to exclusive dominion over the Pacific could not continue longer unrepealed without compelling us to take some measure of public and effectual remonstrance against it. You will declare without reserve that the point to which alone the solicitude of the British government and the jealousy of the British nation attach any importance is the doing away, in a manner as little disagreeable to Russia as possible, of the effect of the ukase of 1821." End quote. Near the close of this instruction, which was quite lengthy, Secretary Canning, impressed with the importance of the main object, repeats himself in these words, quote, "It remains only in recapitulation to remind you of the origin and principles of this whole negotiation. It is not, on our part, essentially a negotiation about limits. It is a demand of the repeal of an offensive and unjustifiable arrogation of exclusive jurisdiction over an ocean of unmeasured extent. We negotiate about territory to cover the remonstrance upon principle." End quote. With this object in view, and under these instructions, the negotiations were initiated at St. Petersburg. It will not be possible to follow them in all their details, which are set forth in the published correspondence of the British negotiators with the Foreign Office and of the Russian negotiators with their ambassador in London. I can only give the leading features. It having been determined that the Treaty of Limits should be agreed upon as a cover to the more essential stipulation to be contained in it, to wit, the disavowal of the maritime jurisdiction, the negotiators, in the first instance, addressed themselves to a fixation of the east and west line, or, more particularly, to the point on the northwest coast of America which should limit the possessions of the two governments. From the first moment the boundary was broached, Russia had indicated that it would rest its claim to territory on the line of latitude 55 degrees, being the limit fixed by the Emperor Paul in the Charter of 1799 to the Russian-American Company, and which had never been objected to by Great Britain. Sir Charles Bagot, however, in the first instance proposed a line drawn through Chatham straight to the head of Lynn Canal, thence northwest to the 140 degree of longitude. This line was rejected by the Russian negotiators, and at the request of Mr. Bagot they submitted a counter-proposal, which was in effect the same as that suggested in the first instance above mentioned, the line of latitude 55 degrees, but, as the parallel of 55 degrees would divide Prince of Wales Island, they proposed to start the boundary line at the southern extremity of that island, and thence follow Portland Channel up to the mountains which border the coast. The Russian proposal was met by a second proposition from Sir Charles Bagot, to wit, a line traced from the west toward the east along the middle of the channel which separates Prince of Wales and Duke of York Islands from all the islands situated to the north of the said islands until it touches the mainland. This was likewise rejected, and he then made a third and final proposal, of a line drawn from the southern extremity of the strait, called Duke of Clarence Sound, through the middle of this strait to the middle of the strait which separates Prince of Wales and Duke of York Islands from all the islands lying north of those islands, thence toward the east through the middle of the same strait to the mainland. This last British proposition was rejected by the Russian negotiators in a paper of some length, in which they set forth the situation of the parties in interest, and why it was impossible for Russia to modify its proposal. They show that the parties whose interests were involved were, on the British side, the Hudson's Bay Company, which was pushing its posts across the Rocky Mountains towards the coast, and the Russian American Company, which was in possession of the islands and maintaining a profitable trade with the natives on the mainland, and that unless the latter was protected by a strip of the coast on the mainland, that company would be without support (point d'appui), and would be exposed to the competition of establishments on the mainland which it was their purpose to exclude. The motive of the Russian negotiators in insisting upon a strip of the coast is also shown in the report of M. Politica, one of the Russian plenipotentiaries to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, of the earliest conferences with Mr. Bagot, in which he said the Russian American Company had mainly in view the establishment of a barrier at which would be stopped once for all to the north and to the west of the coast allotted to our American Company, the encroachments of the English agents of the Hudson's Bay Company. M. Politica to Count Nesselrode, November 3, 1823. On the other hand, the main purpose of the British plenipotentiary in the particular negotiation above referred to was to secure for British traders a foothold on the Pacific Ocean as far above the latitude of 54 degrees 40 seconds as possible. In reporting the result of his conferences to the British Foreign Offices, he says, "Our chief objects were to secure the embouchures of such rivers as might afford an outlet for our fur trade into the Pacific." He further states that his object in presenting the line of Clarence Strait was to preserve uninterrupted our access to the Pacific Ocean, and he adds that the line of the Portland Channel would deprive His Britannic Majesty of sovereignty over all the inlets and small bays lying between latitude 56 degrees and 54 degrees 45 feet, of essential importance to its Hudson Bay's commerce. The negotiators were brought face to face with their conflicting claims, the one side insisting that it must have a strip of territory on the mainland in order to keep the Hudson's Bay Company from the ocean opposite their islands, and the other insisting that the Hudson's Bay Company must have possession of such part of that territory and the inlets as would afford it access to the ocean. Mr. Bagot informed the Russian negotiators that he had made his ultimate proposition, and, being told by them that the Emperor's final decision was that they must continue to insist upon the demarcation as described by them, he announced that he should consider the negotiations as necessarily suspended, and they were accordingly broken off. Count Nesselrode sent to the Russian ambassador in London an account of the negotiations and their abrupt termination, a copy of which was handed to Secretary Canning. In this report he insists that Russia had gone to the extreme of liberality in its concessions to Great Britain. These were, first, an agreement to disavow the maritime jurisdiction; second, to yield its claim to territory from latitude 51 degrees to 54 degrees 40 seconds; third, to grant free access to the British posts in the interior by the rivers which may cross the Russian strip on the mainland; and fourth, to open Sitka to British trade. The Count, after showing that his country was only seeking to hold what its enterprise had gained, and contrasting the spirit of the two nations we wish to keep and the English company wished to obtain, referred to the point upon which the negotiations were broken off, the strip of territory on the mainland, and impressed upon the ambassador the necessity which impelled the emperor to insist upon it, and then made the following emphatic declaration: Russia cannot stretch her concessions further. She will make no others, and she is authorized to expect some concessions on the part of England. The expectations of Russia were not to be disappointed, for in the month following Secretary Canning informed the Russian ambassador in London that Sir Charles Bagot would be instructed to admit with certain qualifications the terms last proposed by the Russian government. The qualifications related to the width of the strip of land required by Russia on the continent, to the boundary in the vicinity of Mount St. Elias, and the free use of the rivers, seas, straits, and waters which the limits assigned to Russia would comprehend. In his instructions to Sir Charles Bagot, Secretary Canning said, "There are 2 points which are left to be settled by Your Excellency. The first, the eastern boundary of the strip of land to be occupied by Russia on the coast, and second, the right of resorting to the territory and waters conceded to Russia." The second negotiations were mainly confined to the second point. In the interval, a treaty had been signed between Russia and the United States, whereby the latter had secured the right for 10 years to frequent the interior seas, gulfs, harbors, and creeks upon the coast, north of 54° 40', for the purpose of trading with the natives of the country. Bagot was instructed to obtain a like privilege for Great Britain, but to secure a longer term than 10 years if possible. He thereupon made a demand for the privilege, not for a term of 10 years, but forever, as to the coast along the strip of land, Le Sierre, up to latitude 60°, and as to Sitka, and for 10 years as to all the other Russian territory in the north. Russia refused the demand on the ground that such a perpetual concession was repugnant to all national feeling, and was inconsistent with the very idea of sovereignty, and the negotiations were again broken off. Thereupon Sir Charles Bagot was recalled, and Sir Stratford Canning, one of the ablest British diplomatists of the present century, was transferred from Washington to St. Petersburg, and the negotiations were again renewed. Sir Stratford Canning was instructed to recede from the demand made by his predecessor, and to accept the language of the Russo-American Treaty as to the use of the territorial waters of the strip of land, Le Sierre. This left only the eastern boundary of this strip to be definitely fixed. It was from these instructions to Canning that I have quoted the liberal language in which occur the expressions. It is not on our part essentially a negotiation about limits, and we negotiate about territory to cover the remonstrance upon principle. In this connection it is proper to note that in the early stage of the negotiations, when Sir Charles Bagot reported that Russia had indicated latitude 55° as the line of division, Secretary Canning replied, "It does not appear how far the line proposed was intended to run to the eastward. If to the Rocky Mountains, it obviously would be wholly inadmissible by us." And later in the instruction he says, quote, "It would be expedient to assign, with respect to the mainland southward of that point, the head of Lynn Harbor, a limit, say, of 50 or 100 miles from the coast, beyond which the Russian posts should not be extended to the eastward. We must not on any account admit the Russian territory to extend at any point to the Rocky Mountains." End quote. With this instruction in his possession, Sir Charles Bagot, at the outset of the negotiations, in response to the Russian demand for a strip of territory, Le Sierre, upon the mainland, which would be parallel to the sinuosities of the coast, proposed that the eastern line of this strip should run, always at a distance of 10 marine leagues from the shore, as far as the 140 degrees of longitude. Russia suggested that the line should run along the mountains which follow the sinuosities of the coast. When the second negotiations were resumed, Secretary Canning sent Mr. Bagot a draft of a treaty in which it was provided that this line should be carried along the coast in a direction parallel to the sinuosities and at and within the seaward base of the mountains by which it is bounded. In explanation, the Secretary said, if pressed by Russia, Mr. Bagot might substitute the summit of the mountains if a limit to the east was fixed beyond which the line should not go. The British draft proposal of the seaward base of the mountains was rejected by Russia, and its counter draft was that the line shall not be wider on the continent than 10 marine leagues. But Sir Charles Bagot's attention was so occupied with the other points of the treaty that the matter of the width of the strip did not receive serious consideration until the final stage of the negotiations was undertaken by Sir Stratford Canning, and as Great Britain had by that time receded from all the other contentions, it only remained for him to adjust the eastern line of the strip of the mainland which was to be held by Russia. In his draft of the treaty, it was proposed that the line should follow the crest of the mountains, provided that if the crest of the mountains should be more than 10 marine leagues from the ocean, the line should follow the sinuosities of the coast, so that it should at no point be more than 10 leagues from the coast. This was in accordance with his instructions. The Russian negotiators objected to the proviso and insisted that the crest of the mountains should be the invariable line, arguing that the natural frontier was the mountains following the coast. End of section 1.